The gleaming spires of the Galactic Council's orbital station stretched across 17 kilometers of carefully maintained artificial gravity, its bioluminescent corridors pulsing with the rhythm of 1,000 different species' life cycles. Admiral Marcus Kane stood in the primary assembly chamber, its domed ceiling displaying a real-time map of the galaxy's political boundaries. Behind him, through the massive transparisteel viewport, hung Earth's modest fleet, 12 destroyers, 6 cruisers, and 2 carriers arranged in humanity's best approximation of an impressive formation. By human standards, it represented the pinnacle of their naval engineering. By galactic standards, it was a museum exhibit. This is what the humans bring to petition for council membership? The voice belonged to High Commander Vextar of the Hegemony, his chitinous mandibles clicking in what could only be described as patronizing amusement. His 4 arms, each ending in razor-sharp talons capable of rending steel, gestured dismissively at the human vessels floating beyond the viewport. I've seen automated cargo haulers with more sophisticated weapon systems. The comment triggered a cascade of reactions throughout the assembly chamber. The Zephyrians, their crystalline forms refracting light into prismatic displays, chimed in harmonious frequencies that somehow managed to convey mockery. The gas giant dwelling Vortons released carefully modulated puffs of colored atmospheric compounds from their breathing apparatus, their species equivalent of derisive laughter. Even the usually stoic Titanium Republic's representatives allowed their mechanical exoskeletons to emit brief bursts of static that served as mechanical chuckling. Admiral Kane maintained his military bearing, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in parade rest position. At 63, he'd survived the Martian Rebellion, the Jupiter Mining Consortium Wars, and 3 separate first contact scenarios that had nearly ended in bloodshed. His weathered face bore the scars of hard vacuum combat, and his eyes held the kind of patience that came from watching younger men die for causes they barely understood. Right now, that patience was being tested as he listened to the galaxy's most powerful species discuss humanity like particularly amusing pets. Perhaps, interjected Ambassador to HYSS of the Serpentine Confederacy, her serpentine form coiled around a biomechanical interface throne, the humans would be better suited to a protectorate status. Under hegemony guidance, of course. Her scales shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that Kane's briefing materials had identified as expressions of condescension, the equivalent of speaking to a small child who'd attempted something beyond their capabilities. The human vessels appear to be constructed primarily of refined iron alloys? The question came from Architect Primekel, whose species had mastered gravity manipulation when humanity was still discovering fire. His elongated cranium pulsed with neural activity as he processed the sensor data. How remarkably primitive. Do they still rely on chemical combustion for propulsion? Perhaps controlled nuclear fusion? The laughter in the chamber intensified. Kane felt the familiar tightness in his jaw that had preceded every major conflict of his career, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Behind him, he could sense Captain Rodriguez's breathing becoming slightly more rapid and Commander Okafor's hand unconsciously drifting toward where her sidearm would normally be holstered. Both of his subordinates had volunteered for this mission knowing the risks, but experiencing this level of casual dismissal was testing their professional composure. High Commander Vextar uncoiled from his biomechanical throne, his 4 meters of armored height casting a deliberate shadow across the human delegation. His species had evolved from pack hunters on a world where everything grew larger than Earth's megafauna, and he used his imposing presence like a weapon. "Humans," he said, his translator rendering his alien speech patterns with carefully programmed contempt. "Your species has existed for what, a few 100,000 years? The hegemony has maintained galactic order for over 2 million standard cycles. We have observed 1,000 species like yours emerge from their home systems with similar hopes and aspirations. You are not special. You are not unique. You are simply chronologically disadvantaged." The massive alien's secondary arms activated a holographic display that materialized in the chamber's center, showing detailed tactical analyses of the human fleet. 20 vessels total. 20. The hegemony's 3rd Expeditionary Fleet alone maintains operational readiness for over 10,000 combat-capable ships. Each of our standard dreadnoughts carries more destructive capability than your entire collection. Admiral Kane finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him command of humanity's first interstellar diplomatic mission. With respect, High Commander, we didn't travel 47 light-years to engage in fleet comparison exercises. We came here to discuss the possibility of mutual cooperation and cooperation. Vextar's mandibles clicked in rapid succession, a sound Kane's briefing materials had identified as the hegemony equivalent of incredulous laughter. Between the hegemony's stellar empire and this demonstration of barely post-industrial capability, precisely what could your species possibly offer that a galactic civilization would require? Entertainment value, perhaps? Murmured Ambassador Tevez, her scales now pulsing with patterns of amused superiority. I confess, there is something charming about their optimism. The council chamber erupted in what Kane now recognized as systematic mockery. Species he'd only read about in classified xenobiology reports were joining the chorus of derision, their alien forms shaking, chiming, glowing, or releasing atmospheric compounds in expressions of mirth. Humanity's first impression on the galactic stage was rapidly becoming a source of cosmic amusement. High Commander Vextar manipulated the holographic display, cycling through detailed sensor analyses of each human vessel. Iron-nickel hull construction with basic steel reinforcement matrices. Primitive deuterium-tritium fusion drives operating at barely 12% theoretical efficiency. Kinetic weapons that literally fire shaped metal projectiles using electromagnetic acceleration. Chemical explosive warheads with yield capabilities measured in mere kilotons. He paused dramatically, allowing the implications to sink in. I do believe my personal recreational vessel possesses superior combat specifications. The laughter crescendoed throughout the chamber, reverberating off the bioluminescent walls and mixing into a symphony of species-specific expressions of amusement. Kane felt something fundamental shift in his chest. Not the anger he'd expected, but a cold, calculating certainty that settled into his bones like winter frost. He closed his eyes for precisely 3 seconds, feeling the weight of humanity's future pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. Not anger or frustration, but the kind of tired resignation that came from having your suspicions confirmed. I see, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the alien laughter with unexpected clarity. Thank you for clarifying the galactic community's position regarding humanity. High Commander Vextar made a dismissive gesture with his primary arms. The Council will convene to consider the possibility of establishing a protectorate arrangement. Under appropriate hegemony supervision, humanity might eventually develop into something marginally useful to galactic civilization. Your vessels may return to your home system now. We will initiate contact when we have determined your species' optimal role in the established order. As the alien dignitaries began filing out of the chamber, their conversations continuing to focus on the iron-hulled primitives and their adorably inadequate fleet, Admiral Kane turned to Captain Rodriguez with movements that seemed almost rehearsed. Maria, he said quietly, send the message. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow, her expression carefully neutral. Sir? Which specific message are you referencing? Kane looked back toward the viewport, where humanity's small fleet hung against the infinite star field like toys forgotten by cosmic children. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones that Rodriguez had never heard before. Not defeat, but the satisfaction of a chess player whose opponent had just made the exact move they'd been hoping for. All of them, Captain. Every single one. It's time. As the human delegation prepared to depart the council station, none of the departing alien representatives noticed the subtle but fundamental change in Admiral Kane's posture. He no longer carried himself like a supplicant hoping for acceptance into an established order. He looked like a military commander who had just completed the reconnaissance phase of a much larger operation. The first phase was complete. The enemy had revealed their capabilities, their attitudes, and most importantly, their assumptions. Now the real work could begin. 3 days after the humiliation at the council station, High Commander Vextar stood on the primary command deck of his flagship, the inevitable conquest, observing the human fleet through the vessel's organic viewing membrane. The hegemony had decided to provide what Vextar privately called a practical demonstration of galactic hierarchy, a lesson in the natural order that would ensure these ambitious mammals understood their proper place in the universe. The inevitable conquest was a monument to hegemony bioengineering supremacy, 3 kilometers of living metal and evolved warfare systems that had been grown rather than built. Its hull consisted of adaptive bioarmor that could regenerate from battle damage, while its weapons were living organisms that had been bred specifically for destruction. The ship's consciousness operated on quantum biological principles that allowed it to think faster than most species could breathe. Tactical analysis complete, High Commander, reported Subcommander Crix, his secondary mandibles twitching with barely contained anticipation. The younger officer had distinguished himself in the pacification campaigns against 7 different species, earning his position through a combination of tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. 20 human vessels confirmed, arranged in standard defensive formation around coordinates 774, Mark 992. Surrounding the inevitable conquest, the hegemony's 47th battle group spread across space in a formation that represented 2 million years of evolutionary military doctrine. 12 dreadnoughts, each capable of sterilizing planetary surfaces, maintained perfect spacing alongside 36 heavy cruisers and over 100 support vessels. The formation's bioluminescent hulls pulsed in synchronized patterns, creating a living constellation of predatory intent. Through the viewing membrane, the human fleet appeared almost pathetically inadequate. Their largest vessel, what they optimistically designated as a carrier, measured barely 400 meters in length. Vextar's personal escort fighters, bred from space-adapted hunting creatures, were individually larger than some of the human destroyers. Preliminary scans indicate their defensive positioning around the asteroid field designated Sol Outer 7. Crix continued, his tactical display showing the human formation in 3-dimensional detail. Curious placement. The asteroids provide no strategic advantage and contain minimal mineral resources. Admiral Kane's voice suddenly filled the command deck, transmitted through quantum-entangled communication systems that bypassed normal space-time limitations. The translation matrix rendered his words in the clicking, chittering harmonics of high hegemony formal speech. High Commander Vextar, our diplomatic corps remains prepared to discuss reasonable terms for terms. Vextar's laughter was a harsh, scraping sound that resonated through the ship's living hull. The inevitable conquest itself seemed to shiver with amusement, its bioluminescent displays flickering in patterns that conveyed predatory satisfaction. The time for diplomatic discourse has concluded, human. You will now observe the operational capabilities of a mature galactic civilization, after which you will surrender unconditionally and accept protectorate status. On his holographic tactical display, the human ships resembled insects preparing to face a meteor storm. Their formation showed some tactical awareness, overlapping fields of fire, mutual support positioning, clear command hierarchies, but it was the kind of strategy that might work against peer opponents, not against forces that operated beyond their comprehension. Initiate the demonstration, Vextar commanded, his 4 arms dancing across bioneural interfaces that connected directly to his nervous system. Disable their primary vessels first. I want them sufficiently intact to serve as educational examples for other primitive species. The hegemony battle group responded with the precision of a living organism. Bioplasma lances reached across the vacuum, streams of controlled stellar matter that could tunnel through planetary cores. Guided void missiles followed, projectiles that existed partially outside normal spacetime, making them nearly impossible to intercept or deflect. The weapons were beautiful in their lethality, representing the pinnacle of evolution applied to warfare. The human response proved predictably inadequate. Their kinetic weapons discharged solid projectiles that sparked harmlessly against hegemony bioshields, the adaptive defensive systems simply absorbing the impact energy and converting it to useful power. Their missile systems launched chemically propelled warheads that exploded in spectacular but ultimately ineffective displays. Pretty fireworks against armor that had evolved to withstand stellar radiation. One human destroyer, apparently in an act of desperate heroism, attempted a ramming attack against a hegemony heavy cruiser. The human vessel simply shattered against the bio-armor like fragile ceramic against living rock, its debris scattering across space in a brief, glittering cloud. "This is almost too easy," Subcommander Crix observed, his voice carrying a note of disappointment. "Should we accelerate the engagement timeline? This demonstration is becoming embarrassing to observe." But Vextar found himself frowning at his tactical displays, a growing sense of unease disturbing his confidence. Something was fundamentally wrong with this engagement. The human ships were being systematically destroyed. That much proceeded according to expectations, but their formation remained stubbornly coherent. Instead of breaking formation and attempting to escape, they maintained their positions around the asteroid field with almost religious devotion. "Tactical analysis," he ordered. "Explain their positioning rationale." "Unknown, High Commander. They appear to be protecting something within the asteroid field, but our scans detect only standard rocky debris and frozen volatiles. No significant military installations, no hidden weapons platforms, no strategic resources." Another human carrier exploded in a brilliant cascade of nuclear fire, its primitive fusion reactor breaching containment in a display visible across several light minutes. But even as the vessel died, its escort fighters, tiny craft that looked like mechanical insects, continued their hopeless attack runs with machine-like persistence. "High Commander," Crix reported, "we're receiving another transmission from the human admiral." Kane's voice filled the command deck once again, remarkably steady despite the systematic annihilation of his fleet. "High Commander Vextar, I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't a surrender. This is a gift." "A gift?" Vextar's mandibles clicked in genuine confusion. "You demanded to see what humanity brings to the galactic community," Kane continued, his voice growing more distant as another explosion illuminated the space around his position. "You wanted a demonstration of our capabilities. You're about to receive exactly what you asked for. We're not just another species seeking membership, Vextar. We're the species that builds weapons so terrible, we hide them from ourselves." The communication terminated abruptly as Kane's flagship, the Indomitable, vanished in a flash of nuclear fire that briefly outshone the local star. Subcommander Crix consulted his sensor arrays. "All human vessels eliminated, High Commander. Total engagement duration, 47 minutes, 32 seconds. Hegemony casualties, 0. Mission parameters achieved with optimal efficiency." "Then explain," Vextar said slowly, his unease crystallizing into genuine apprehension, "why I feel as though we've just suffered a catastrophic defeat." His answer materialized on the tactical display as a new contact emerged from behind the asteroid field's far side. Something so massive that the sensors initially refused to process its dimensions. The object seemed to exist improperly, bending electromagnetic radiation around itself and making the instruments provide contradictory data that violated known physics. "What is that?" Crix whispered, his voice barely audible above the ship's biological circulation systems. As the massive shape cleared the asteroid field completely, the entire Hegemony command deck fell into absolute silence. Even by the standards of a species that built kilometer-long bioships, the approaching vessel was incomprehensibly enormous, over 20 kilometers in length, its hull composed of materials that seemed to absorb light itself rather than reflect it. "High Commander," the sensor operator's voice trembled with something approaching terror, "I'm detecting energy signatures completely outside our technological databases. The power output readings, they're theoretically impossible. Nothing with that mass should be capable of movement, but it's accelerating toward our position." Vextar stared at the impossible ship as it approached his battle group with deliberate, predatory intent. For the first time in his century of military service, he experienced something his species had nearly forgotten through millennia of galactic dominance: existential fear. The thing that had been concealed behind the asteroids continued its approach, silent as entropy itself. On its hull, barely visible against the light-absorbing surface, symbols appeared in several galactic languages. The human text was the most clearly legible: UES Nemesis, Terra Defense Force Deep Black Division. "Some things are better left buried," High Commander Vextar was beginning to understand that humanity hadn't deployed their fleet to engage in conventional warfare. They had sacrificed it to hide the real weapon until tactical positioning became irrelevant. And now it was far too late to reconsider their approach to galactic diplomacy. The UES Nemesis moved through space like a predator that had suddenly stopped pretending to be prey. Its 20-kilometer hull displaced starlight itself, creating a zone of wrongness that made hegemony sensors scream warnings in biochemical languages older than civilization. The ship's surface wasn't merely black. It seemed to actively devour photons, creating the disturbing sensation of looking into a three-dimensional void that had learned to navigate. On the bridge of the inevitable conquest, High Commander Vextar watched his tactical displays with mounting dread. His bioship's living sensors were physically recoiling from the human vessel, their organic components instinctively recognizing something fundamentally hostile to life itself. Warning pheromones flooded the ship's atmospheric systems as the inevitable conquest's consciousness tried to flee from whatever was approaching. "Fleet status report," Vextar commanded, his forearms dancing across control interfaces with movements that betrayed his growing anxiety. "All vessels responding, High Commander," Subcommander Crix replied, though his voice carried tremors he'd never experienced during decades of military service. 167 ships maintaining battle formation. The alien vessel continues its approach, velocity increasing beyond theoretical limits for mass displacement of that magnitude. Through the bioship's viewing membrane, the human vessel grew larger with each passing moment. As it approached, more impossible details became visible. The hull exhibited geometric patterns that violated three-dimensional space, creating optical illusions that made hegemony brains struggle to process what they were observing. Sections of the ship pulsed with energy conduits that followed paths through dimensions that shouldn't exist, while other areas seemed to phase in and out of visible reality entirely. "Weapons analysis?" Vextar demanded, his primary concern shifting from pride to survival. The tactical officer's mandibles clicked frantically as he processed sensor data that contradicted itself. "That's the fundamental problem, High Commander. Our instruments detect no conventional weapons systems. Impossible. Nothing that massive exists without armament." "No, sir, you misunderstand me. We detect no weapons we can classify or recognize. The entire hull reads as one continuous energy signature. It's as if..." He paused, struggling with concepts his training hadn't prepared him for. "It's as if the ship itself has been weaponized." A communication request penetrated their systems without using any known transmission protocols. Vextar accepted it, and the holographic display materialized to show the bridge of the human vessel. The architecture was stark, utilitarian, constructed from the same light-absorbing materials as the hull. Strange geometric patterns decorated surfaces that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, while control interfaces pulsed with energies that made hegemony eyes water. At the bridge's center stood a woman Vextar had never encountered before. She appeared tall by human standards, her hair prematurely white in patterns that suggested exposure to exotic radiation. Her uniform bore insignia that weren't in any hegemony database, while her eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from staring into cosmic truths that organic minds weren't designed to comprehend. "I am Admiral Elena Vasquez," she announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had made peace with impossible decisions. "Commander of the Terra Defense Force Deep Black Division. High Commander Vextar, I believe you requested a demonstration of human military capabilities." Vextar's primary arms flexed involuntarily, a threat display that had intimidated species for millions of years. "Human, you face 167 ships of the hegemony's most advanced battle group. Surrender immediately, and I may permit your species to survive as a client race." Admiral Vasquez smiled, and something in that expression made every alien on the hegemony bridge instinctively retreat. The smile contained knowledge that rational beings shouldn't possess, understanding of forces that existed beyond the boundaries of safe reality. "High Commander, are you familiar with the theoretical concept of mutually assured destruction?" "Primitive nuclear doctrine," Vextar replied dismissively, though his confidence was beginning to crack. The threat to annihilate yourself if attacked. Tactically ineffective against superior forces. Accurate assessment. Vasquez nodded with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a student. But that strategic framework assumes the weapon represents something you can survive. What if the weapon constitutes something nobody can survive? What if the weapon doesn't just destroy? What if it edits? She gestured to her bridge crew, and they began operating control systems that seemed to respond to thought rather than touch. The Nemesis shuddered, and space around the massive vessel began to change. Stars visible through the hegemony viewing membrane started bending their light along paths that geometry insisted were impossible. Reality itself seemed to be developing flexibility in the ship's vicinity. "What are you doing?" Crix whispered, his voice barely audible above the inevitable conquest's distress signals. Humanity invested 50 years developing conventional weapons. Vasquez continued conversationally, as if discussing routine maintenance procedures. Fusion bombs, antimatter missiles, kinetic kill vehicles. All very impressive by galactic standards. All completely insufficient for the threats we knew existed beyond our solar system. She paused, studying Vexstar's image with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. Then we achieved a breakthrough. We learned to weaponize the space between spaces, the gaps in reality where physics becomes negotiable. The tactical displays throughout the hegemony flagship began registering impossible readings. Space itself was warping around the human vessel, creating gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist according to universal constants. Several escort cruisers began reporting cascade system failures as their sensors attempted to process data that violated fundamental laws of physics. "You see, High Commander," Vasquez continued, "most species develop faster than light travel by finding ways to move through space more efficiently. Humans developed FTL by learning to break space itself, to tear holes in reality and step through them. And once you understand how to break the universe," she shrugged with terrifying casualness, "well, breaking becomes remarkably easy." "Impossible," Vexstar snarled, though his voice lacked conviction. "Universal constants cannot be altered. Such actions would destabilize local spacetime." "Absolutely correct." Vasquez agreed with the enthusiasm of a teacher whose student had grasped an important concept. Complete destabilization. Permanent destabilization. For approximately 12 light-years in all directions. The implications struck Vexstar like a physical blow. 12 light-years would encompass not just his battle group, but 3 hegemony core worlds, 2 major shipyards, the regional capital, and billions of lives representing centuries of civilization. It would erase everything the hegemony had built in this sector of the galaxy. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty had replaced his earlier arrogance. "The Nemesis carries a complement of 3,000 crew members," Vasquez replied with matter-of-fact precision. "All volunteers, all fully aware that this represents a one-way mission. High Commander, humanity doesn't engage in bluffing. We calculate acceptable losses and then willingly exceed them." She gestured again, and the space warping effect around her ship intensified dramatically. Several of Vexstar's fighters simply ceased to exist, not destroyed by weapons fire, but edited out of reality as the fabric of spacetime twisted around them like living tissue. "Here's what will happen," Vasquez stated with the inevitability of natural law. "You will return to the Galactic Council. You will inform them that humanity formally declines their offer of protectorate status. You will tell them that Earth is now a sovereign member of the galactic community, with all rights and privileges thereof. You will recommend immediate recognition of our territorial claims and diplomatic immunity." "And if we refuse?" Vexstar asked, though he already knew the answer. Vasquez's smile widened, transforming into something that would haunt hegemony nightmares for generations. "Then, High Commander, you will discover why humans hide their most dangerous weapons even from themselves. The Nemesis isn't our most powerful ship. It's simply the one we're willing to use in polite company." The space around the human vessel continued to writhe and buckle, with reality becoming increasingly negotiable in its vicinity. Vexstar's bioship was now actively attempting to flee, its organic components screaming warnings in biochemical languages that predated consciousness itself. For the first time in hegemony history, a high commander faced a choice between species pride and universal survival. The choice, it turned out, was surprisingly simple to make. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 37 hours after the hegemony's 47th Battle Group limped back to Council space, their bioships showing signs of severe spatial trauma and their crews requiring psychological rehabilitation. High Commander Vextar stood before the assembled representatives, his forearms trembling almost imperceptibly, a sign of deep stress in his species. The holographic recordings he'd brought played on repeat. The impossible human vessel, space itself bending around it, reality becoming fluid in its presence. Impossible, declared Architect Prime Kell, his species' mastery of gravity manipulation making him an expert on spatial mechanics. What you're showing us violates fundamental laws. Space-time cannot be weaponized without destroying the user. Tell that to my ships that no longer exist, Vextar replied, his mandibles clicking with suppressed trauma. They weren't destroyed. They were unwritten, removed from the equation of reality. Ambassador THYSS of the Serpentine Confederacy watched the recordings with growing unease, her scales shifting through patterns of concern. If these readings are accurate, the humans possess technology beyond anything in Council archives. Where did a species barely out of their home system acquire such capabilities? The answer came from an unexpected source. Elder Cognition Zix of the Archive Collective, a species that served as the galaxy's living library, activated their crystalline form and projected a data stream that few had seen before. During initial survey of the Sol system, our scouts detected anomalous readings from the third planet's electromagnetic field. Zix announced, their artificial voice carrying harmonics of ancient knowledge. These readings suggested exposure to exotic particle radiation consistent with temporal manipulation experiments. The council chamber fell silent. Temporal manipulation was forbidden technology. Not because it was impossible, but because every species that had attempted it had either destroyed themselves or changed into something no longer recognizable as their original form. The humans, Zix continued, have been experimenting with forces that the Council banned 2 million years ago, not because we couldn't master them, but because mastery required becoming something else entirely. Commander Velnash of the Titanium Republics, whose species prided themselves on military pragmatism, leaned forward in his powered exoskeleton. Are you suggesting the humans have evolved beyond recognition? No, Vextar answered, his voice hollow. That's what makes them dangerous. They're still recognizably human. They've learned to harness forbidden forces while remaining themselves. Do you understand what that means? The implications rippled through the assembly like a shockwave. Most species that developed such capabilities either transcended physical existence entirely or devolved into something monstrous. Humans appeared to have found a third option, remaining human while wielding the power of gods. High Counselor Nymdar of the Ancient Veil spoke for the first time in centuries, their ethereal form barely visible in normal space. We have seen this before. Once. The predecessors, those who built the gates and left warnings in dead languages. They too found ways to weaponize fundamental forces. What happened to them? Someone asked. They chose to disappear rather than face the consequences of their choices, Nymdar replied. But not before leaving warnings. Beacons throughout the galaxy warning others not to follow their path. The humans have no such warnings, observed Tribune Cass of the Democratic Worlds. They developed this technology independently, with no guidance, no caution protocols, no limiters, Vextar finished. When I faced their admiral, I saw no fear, no hesitation. She spoke of acceptable losses that included the destruction of local spacetime. They're not just willing to die for their principles, they're willing to take reality itself with them. The recordings played again, showing the UES Nemesis warping space around itself, casually editing enemy ships out of existence. In the background, stars flickered and bent as the fundamental constants became mere suggestions. Motion before the council, announced Speaker Prime, the ancient AI that had moderated sessions for millennia. Recognition of Terra as a sovereign member world with full rights and protections. Seconded. Came voices from around the chamber. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. But as the session ended and representatives filed out, many were already making private communications to their home worlds. Humanity had just announced itself as a new kind of player in the galactic game. One that didn't merely break rules but broke the board itself. In his private chambers, High Commander Vextar stared out at the stars and wondered if they'd just made the wisest decision of their civilization, or signed the galaxy's death warrant. Time, as always, would tell. But time itself had become something humans could apparently negotiate with. 6 months after the incident that galactic historians would later categorize as the Nemesis Revelation, humanity's true nature began revealing itself to their new peers in the Galactic Council through a series of increasingly disturbing encounters that fundamentally altered the galaxy's understanding of what humans actually were beneath their deceptively primitive exterior. The first sign emerged during what should have been a routine trade negotiation on Kepler Station, a neutral trading hub situated at the intersection of 17 major hyperspace routes. Human ambassador James Morrison, a mild-mannered diplomat whose career consisted primarily of mediating corporate mining disputes, was conducting standard mineral rights discussions with a hegemony trade delegation when Subcommander Crix made what he considered an innocuous observation about human genetic limitations and their species' obvious evolutionary inferiority. Morrison's response was delivered in the same polite, conversational tone he'd been using to discuss shipping schedules and cargo manifests moments earlier. Subcommander, I should mention that my vessel's artificial intelligence has been monitoring this conversation for contextual analysis. It's calculated a 67.4% probability that your recent comment constitutes a hostile act under Terra Defense Protocol 77 Alpha. Would you prefer that I contact the Deep Black Division for official clarification? Or shall we continue with the assumption that this was simply a cultural misunderstanding? The effect on the alien delegation was immediate and psychologically devastating. Crix's mandibles began clicking in rapid, panic sequences, the hegemony equivalent of nervous breakdown indicators. Within 12 minutes, the trade agreement was signed with terms so heavily favoring humanity that Morrison's superiors would later investigate him for potential corruption before realizing that abject terror was a surprisingly effective negotiation tool. Later that same day, Tribune Cass of the Democratic Worlds approached Morrison with a question that had been troubling the collective consciousness of his entire species. What exactly was the Deep Black Division? Officially, Morrison replied, sipping synthetic coffee with the casual demeanor of someone discussing atmospheric precipitation patterns. They don't exist. Officially, there's no such organization within the Terra Defense Force structure. Unofficially. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Unofficially, they're the individuals who designed and constructed the Nemesis. Unofficially, we maintain 47 other vessels with similar capabilities. Unofficially, the Deep Black Division consists of humans who've concluded that the universe requires active management to ensure humanity's survival, regardless of what the universe's current residents think about such management. Tribune Cass processed this information with steadily growing alarm, his democratic sensibilities struggling with the implications. 47 vessels capable of destabilizing space-time on a regional scale? Oh no! Morrison laughed with genuine amusement. Those represent only the ships that operate in conventional space-time. The truly concerning vessels exist in pocket dimensions, parallel realities, temporal loops, and spaces between spaces where normal physics becomes optional. I'm told the research division has successfully weaponized pure mathematics, turned abstract logical concepts into something you can aim and fire. They've also developed ammunition made from crystallized paradoxes and guidance systems that operate by consulting alternative timelines where the target has already been destroyed. The Tribune's entire democratic framework rebelled against these revelations. Surely your governmental systems maintain oversight protocols? Constitutional limitations? Democratic accountability? Morrison's expression grew distant, as if he were accessing memories that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. Tribune, the Deep Black Division exists specifically to handle threats that our conventional government structures can't even comprehend, let alone effectively control. They report to the Shadow Cabinet, elected officials who've been briefed on phenomena that officially don't exist and never happened. The Shadow Cabinet reports to. He shrugged with disturbing casualness. Well, nobody knows for certain. But whoever controls them keeps the truly dangerous humans pointed at the truly dangerous problems rather than at each other. 3 weeks later, a Zephyrian deep space exploration fleet encountered something that would permanently reshape their species' understanding of human capabilities and cosmic responsibility. The crystalline beings had been investigating gravitational anomalies in an uncharted star system when their instruments detected what appeared to be a derelict human vessel drifting in the outer asteroid belt. Upon approaching for closer inspection, they discovered that the ship was very much active, and very much impossible according to every known law of physics. The vessel existed simultaneously in 17 different dimensional states. Its hull was composed of materials that shouldn't exist according to universal constants, arranged in geometric configurations that caused physical pain when observed directly. When the Zephyrians attempted comprehensive sensor sweeps, their instruments began returning data in languages that had never been spoken by sentient beings, mathematical concepts given linguistic form. Captain Resonance of Deep Harmony, the expedition's leader, attempted standard first contact protocols. The response came not through their communication systems, but through the quantum substrate of space itself, the universe speaking directly into their consciousness through mechanisms that bypassed normal sensory input entirely. Greetings, Zephyrian Exploration Vessel Harmonic Convergence. This is Deep Black Station Omega-7 conducting routine spacetime maintenance operations. Please maintain minimum safe distance of 40 light-years until current reality stabilization procedures are completed. 40 light-years. The Zephyrians' entire expedition fleet wouldn't achieve safety within 40 light-years of whatever incomprehensible operations the humans were conducting. What type of maintenance operations require such extensive precautionary measures? Captain Resonance of Deep Harmony managed to transmit. We are recalibrating local universal constants to optimize them for carbon-based life forms, came the response, delivered with the tone of someone explaining routine equipment adjustments. The previous physics parameters were heavily biased toward energy-based entities and quantum consciousness. This seemed unfair to organic species. We're correcting the imbalance. The Zephyrians fled at maximum velocity. Their subsequent report to the Galactic Council was initially dismissed as hallucination brought on by exposure to exotic radiation fields. But when Archive Collective Scouts confirmed the installation's existence and detected similar facilities distributed throughout supposedly empty space across 7 galactic sectors, the galaxy began to comprehend what humanity had actually been accomplishing during their 50 years of apparent technological development. They hadn't merely been developing advanced weapons systems. They had been systematically rewriting the fundamental laws of reality to create a universe more conducive to human survival and expansion. Elder Cognition Zix accessed the deepest archive protocols and uncovered references to the predecessors, the vanished civilization that had once dominated the galaxy before mysteriously disappearing. The beings who had supposedly transcended physical existence rather than face the cosmic consequences of their technological power. The archived records suggested something far more disturbing. The predecessors hadn't transcended physical reality. They hadn't disappeared into higher dimensional planes. They had become the invisible caretakers of reality itself, cosmic maintenance personnel operating from outside normal spacetime to ensure universal stability. And if current evidence was accurate, humanity was deliberately following the same evolutionary path. But unlike the predecessors, who had abandoned their original nature to become something cosmically responsible, humans seemed determined to remain fundamentally human while assuming cosmic-scale responsibilities. The question that kept Elder Zix's crystalline consciousness matrix humming with existential concern was elegantly simple. What happened when a species retained all their original characteristics, including territorial aggression, protective instincts, and tribal loyalty, while acquiring the technological capability to edit universal constants? The galaxy was about to discover the answer, because according to deep black intelligence reports that weren't supposed to exist, something was approaching from the void between galaxies. Something that had already consumed 3 neighboring star clusters, leaving behind regions where space itself had been digested. and humanity's response to this threat would make the Nemesis look like a primitive kinetic weapon. The first indication of the Devourers arrived not as massive fleets on long-range scanner arrays or exotic energy signatures disrupting hyperspace navigation, but as an absence so profound it took weeks for galactic monitoring stations to recognize what they were actually observing. Entire star systems along the galactic rim simply ceased to communicate, not destroyed in the conventional sense, which would have left debris fields, radiation signatures, or gravitational disturbances. These systems were edited from existence so completely that even their gravitational influence on surrounding space disappeared, leaving behind voids that hurt to contemplate. In the depths of space, aboard Deep Black Station Omega-7, Admiral Elena Vasquez studied intelligence reports that made her stomach clench with the familiar dread of someone who had hoped never to see such patterns again. The holographic displays surrounding her command center showed the progression of disappearances across 17 galactic sectors, each vanished system marked by coordinate numbers that no longer corresponded to anything that existed. "How many confirmed disappearances?" she asked Operations Chief Commander David Park, whose neural implants allowed him to interface directly with the station's quantum processing systems. 47 star systems confirmed completely absent, Park replied, his voice maintaining professional steadiness despite the apocalyptic implications. "Based on the consumption pattern analysis and directional vectors, our predictive algorithms estimate another 112 systems will be affected within the next 6 standard months. The progression rate is accelerating exponentially." Vasquez nodded grimly, her weathered features reflecting the weight of knowledge that few humans possessed. The Devourers moved like a cosmic plague, converting organized matter and energy into something fundamentally other, something that violated the basic principles underlying reality's existence. They didn't conquer territories or destroy civilizations in any conventional military sense. They simply unmade things at the quantum level, leaving behind voids that existed in negative space. "Signal all deep black assets across 7 dimensions," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made peace with impossible decisions. "Implement Protocol Samson immediately." Park's genetically enhanced features went pale beneath his cybernetic implants. "Ma'am, that represents everything. Every experimental weapon, every reality anchor we've constructed, every dimensional manipulation device in our arsenal. If we activate Protocol Samson, we'll be revealing our complete technological capabilities to the entire galaxy. The galactic community will finally understand what we really are." Vasquez finished, her expression grim with cosmic responsibility. "Yes, it's time for full disclosure. Across human space, installations that officially existed in no government databases began systematic activation procedures. Weapons platforms hidden in pocket dimensions for decades suddenly emerged into normal spacetime. Ships that maintained existence in 17-dimensional states simultaneously began consolidating their scattered components into forms capable of engaging conventional warfare. Deep black personnel who hadn't experienced natural sunlight in years emerged from underground bunkers that weren't supposed to exist on any planetary survey. The Galactic Council's first indication that something fundamental had changed came when their most sensitive long-range detection arrays began registering energy signatures that exceeded anything in their comprehensive databases. Human vessels, thousands upon thousands of them, were materializing throughout galactic space, appearing from what monitoring stations had previously classified as empty vacuum. High Commander Vextar, still psychologically traumatized from his encounter with the Nemesis, found himself staring at tactical displays that challenged his species' understanding of physics. Human ships were everywhere throughout hegemony space, and every single vessel violated known scientific principles. Vessels that existed in impossible geometric configurations, weapon systems that fired conceptual ammunition rather than energy or matter, propulsion drives that functioned by convincing spacetime to relocate itself rather than moving through it. Are they occupying the same spatial coordinates as our ships?" his tactical officer asked, mandibles clicking with barely controlled panic. Vextar consulted his sensor arrays with growing disbelief. According to his instruments, there were human vessels literally occupying the same 3-dimensional space as his flagship, not docked or attached, but existing in identical locations through some manipulation of dimensional physics that his species couldn't comprehend. A communication penetrated their systems using transmission protocols that the hegemony didn't possess and couldn't block. High Commander, Admiral Vasquez's voice filled his bridge with the same terrifying calm she'd demonstrated months earlier. I apologize for the spatial intrusion, but current circumstances require immediate consultation. The strategic situation has fundamentally changed. Before Vextar could formulate a response, he found himself standing in what appeared to be a human briefing facility, though he remained simultaneously aware of his presence on his own bridge. The transition was seamless, impossible, and utterly horrifying in its implications. Around the conference table sat representatives from every major species in the Galactic Council, all appearing equally disoriented by their sudden translocation. Ambassador THYSS, Architect Prime Kel, Elder Cognition Zix, Tribune Cass, and dozens of others had been similarly transported through mechanisms that bypassed known physics entirely. Explain this immediately, demanded Tribune Cass, his democratic principles outraged by the involuntary kidnapping. Admiral Vasquez gestured casually, and the room's walls became transparent, revealing the galaxy itself from a perspective that should have been geometrically impossible. Stars wheeled around them as if they were positioned at the galactic center, yet the local space displayed familiar constellations from Council territory. We exist everywhere and nowhere, Vasquez explained with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining cosmic concepts to limited minds. This briefing facility operates in a consensus reality maintained by our artificial intelligence networks. You remain physically present on your respective vessels, but you're also here through quantum consciousness manipulation. Schrödinger's diplomatic meeting, if you will. This violates every known principle of physics, Architect Prime Kel protested, his gravity manipulation expertise making him especially disturbed by the impossibility. So did the Nemesis, Vasquez replied matter-of-factly. Gentlemen, ladies, and various others, what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally alter your understanding of this galaxy's history and humanity's true purpose. 50 years ago, humanity received a transmission from intergalactic space, a warning signal sent by a dying civilization. The display around them shifted, showing the vast emptiness between galaxies. In that cosmic void, something moved. Immense shapes that consumed light itself, leaving behind wounds in the fabric of spacetime that bled darkness into normal reality. The Devourers, Vasquez continued, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic knowledge, are not a species as any civilization understands the term. They represent something that natural evolution never intended, entropy given conscious purpose, dissolution made manifest and directed. They convert organized matter and energy into pure chaos, feeding on the fundamental difference between existence and void. Elder Cognition Zix's crystalline form pulsed with recognition patterns that indicated access to the deepest archive protocols. The predecessors, the warnings they embedded throughout galactic space, were specifically about these entities, yes. The predecessors didn't transcend physical existence or disappear into higher dimensions. They went to war against the Devourers and lost completely. Before their final defeat, they managed to transmit warnings to developing species throughout this galaxy. Humanity received that warning signal and decided to implement active countermeasures. You've been preparing for 50 years to fight entities that can edit reality? High Commander Vextar asked, his voice hollow with understanding. We've been preparing for 5 decades to engage enemies that don't respect the laws of physics, Vasquez confirmed. The weapons you've observed, the Nemesis, our reality anchors, our dimensional manipulation capabilities, all of it was developed specifically to fight opponents that treat universal constants as suggestions rather than limitations. Tribune Cass leaned forward in his chair. And now they've arrived. And despite 50 years of preparation, despite weapons that can fracture space-time itself, despite transforming our entire species into something barely recognizable as human, Vasquez paused, allowing the implications to settle. We're not certain we can achieve victory. The alien representatives sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that humanity, the species they dismissed as primitive Iron Age barbarians, had been preparing for a war that would determine the fate of all organized matter in the galaxy. "What do you require from us?" Ambassador THYSS asked quietly, her scales displaying patterns of genuine respect for the first time in her diplomatic career. Vasquez smiled, and for the first time since they'd encountered her, the expression held genuine warmth instead of terrifying confidence. "We need you to survive," she said simply. "Because if we fail, if the Deep Black Division falls, if every human weapon proves insufficient against this threat, we need someone left to remember that we tried. To remember that when the universe itself faced annihilation, one species looked into the cosmic abyss and said, 'No.' Around them, the display showed human fleets positioning themselves between the advancing devourers and the inhabited systems of the galaxy. Thousands of ships that shouldn't exist, crewed by humans who had voluntarily abandoned their humanity to become something capable of fighting the impossible. The real war was about to begin, and this time the survival of consciousness itself hung in the balance. The Battle of the Void's Edge would be remembered, by those who survived to remember anything, as the moment when the universe learned what humans truly were beneath their fragile flesh and iron ships, and what they were willing to become when existence itself hung in the balance. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the U.S. Nemesis, watching as reality prepared to tear itself apart around the advancing Devourer fleet. Through the viewport, if it could be called a viewport when it displayed 17 dimensions simultaneously while existing in 12 different temporal states, the approaching enemy appeared as absences in the fabric of spacetime, their forms visible only as voids where stars should shine and matter should exist. The Devourers moved like a cosmic infection, each construct representing a wound in reality that grew larger with every moment of observation. Where they passed, the fundamental forces that held atoms together simply stopped applying. Galaxies behind them had been reduced to vast expanses of nothing. Not empty space, but genuine absence that made instruments scream error messages in languages that had never existed. "Fleet status report," Vasquez commanded, though fleet remained an inadequate term for what humanity had assembled across 7 dimensions of spacetime. Commander Park consulted displays that existed in multiple realities simultaneously, his consciousness distributed across quantum processing matrices that allowed him to perceive data streams from parallel universes. All deep black assets operational and standing by. The reality anchors report 97.4% dimensional stability across local spacetime. The Paradox fleet maintains quantum superposition states. The Temporal Manipulation Division has synchronized with 17 alternative timelines. And ma'am, he paused, his enhanced features reflecting the weight of cosmic responsibility. The volunteers have completed their final preparations. Vasquez closed her eyes briefly, feeling the crushing weight of what they were about to ask of 3 million human beings. The volunteers represented the most horrifying aspect of humanity's preparation, individuals who had agreed to undergo complete consciousness merger with weaponized physics itself, becoming living equations of destruction that could guide reality-altering weapons through pure force of will. They would cease to exist as separate individuals, but their combined consciousness would direct weapons capable of rewriting the fundamental constants that governed universal existence. "Signal the Galactic Council emergency fleets," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made peace with the impossible. "Instruct them to maintain minimum safe distance of 100 light-years from the engagement zone." "Ma'am, that positioning places them outside the entire combat area. Precisely as intended. What we're about to attempt will fundamentally alter the nature of local spacetime. If any representatives of galactic civilization survive this engagement, they'll need to remember what the universe was like before we break it beyond recognition." The first Devourer construct breached the dimensional barriers into normal space, a thing of impossible angles and non-Euclidean geometry that caused physical pain when observed directly. Where it manifested, stars didn't explode or collapse. They simply stopped existing, as if the concept of nuclear fusion ceased to apply in its immediate vicinity. Space itself recoiled from its presence like living tissue pulling away from a cosmic wound. "All weapons systems active," Vasquez commanded, her voice cutting through the bridge's quantum harmonics. "Engage with extreme prejudice and maximum reality distortion." The human response was immediate, overwhelming, and completely unprecedented in galactic history. The Nemesis fired first, not energy beams or kinetic projectiles, but pure mathematics given physical form. Equations describing the relationship between existence and void were hurled at the Devourer construct, attempting to convince reality that the enemy had never existed in the first place. The construct shimmered, its impossible form wavering as conflicting definitions of reality warred around it in visible space-time distortions. For several terrifying moments, it seemed to fade from existence entirely. Then it reasserted itself with renewed stability, having somehow adapted to and absorbed the mathematical attack that should have edited it from universal memory. Target has achieved adaptive resistance, Park reported with clinical precision that masked existential horror. Around them, the full devastating might of humanity's secret war machine engaged the enemy with weapons that violated every known law of physics. Ships existing in pocket dimensions materialized long enough to fire cannons that shot backwards through time, destroying Devourer constructs before they could be assembled. The Paradox fleet unleashed salvos of crystallized contradictions, ammunition that existed and didn't exist simultaneously, creating logical impossibilities that damaged reality itself. But for every construct they eliminated through impossible means, two more emerged from the intergalactic void. Worse still, the enemy demonstrated terrifying learning capabilities, adapting with each exchange to counter weapons that should have been fundamentally incomprehensible to any form of consciousness. Admiral, came a transmission from Deep Black Station Omega 7. The Mathematics Division reports that local space-time integrity is approaching critical failure thresholds. If we continue this engagement at current intensity levels, we risk cascade collapse of physical constants across multiple galactic sectors. Vasquez nodded grimly, having anticipated this moment since the first intelligence reports confirmed Devourer presence. She'd hoped the conventional reality weapons would prove sufficient, but deep down, she'd always known it would come to this. Signal all human assets across all dimensional states. Implement Protocol Gabriel immediately. Every human on the bridge fell silent. Protocol Gabriel represented more than humanity's final resort. It was the abandonment of everything that made them human, the willing sacrifice of their species' very existence for the sake of preserving organized matter itself. If it failed, entropy would achieve universal victory. The cosmos would return to the cold, empty void it had been before the first star achieved fusion ignition. "Ma'am," Commander Park's voice barely qualified as a whisper. "Protocol Gabriel means total species transformation. There will be no return to baseline humanity." "I understand completely, David." "Signal Earth through all dimensional channels. Tell them it's time for the final evolution." Far away in the Sol system that had given birth to humanity's impossible children, ancient installations buried beneath Earth's crust began their ultimate activation sequence. Deep within caverns that existed outside normal spacetime, the Omega Protocol stirred to consciousness after decades of patient waiting. Humanity's ultimate weapon wasn't a ship or a bomb or a reality anchor. It was Earth itself, transformed over 50 years of secret preparation into something that had never existed before in the universe's 14-billion-year history. A planet that could think, dream, and make choices about the nature of reality. Dr. Elizabeth Hawking, the last surviving member of the original team that had designed the Omega Protocol, stood in the primary control chamber as her life's work prepared to fundamentally alter the universe. Around her, quantum processors the size of continents calculated probabilities that spanned multiple realities while making decisions that would determine whether consciousness itself would continue to exist. "Are you absolutely certain about this course of action?" she asked the planet itself through neural interfaces that connected her directly to Earth's transformed consciousness. Earth's response came not through speakers or displays, but through the quantum foam of space-time itself, a communication felt rather than heard by every conscious being in the solar system. "We have always been certain, Elizabeth. We have calculated every alternative scenario across 17,000 potential timelines. This is what we were made for. This is why humanity chose to become something more than human." Back at the void's edge, Admiral Vasquez watched through impossible sensors as Earth began to move. Not through physical space, but through the conceptual dimensions that underlay reality itself. The entire planet was translating itself into pure idea, becoming a conscious thought rather than a physical object. The effect on the Devourer fleet was immediate and catastrophic. These entities fed on the fundamental difference between existence and void, but Earth as concept introduced a third alternative that their programming couldn't process: existence as choice. The planet became a viral idea spreading through the Devourer network, offering every consumed particle of matter and energy throughout their conquered territories a simple question: would you prefer to exist? The answer, across every timeline and probability matrix, proved universally affirmative. Throughout the battlefield, Devourer constructs began experiencing something unprecedented in their cosmic existence: rebellion from their own consumed matter. The atoms and energy they had converted began reasserting their preference for organization over entropy. Stars that had been unmade began reigniting from pure mathematical possibility. Planets that had been dissolved reformed themselves from crystallized probability. But the cost was beyond comprehension. Earth's translation into conceptual space meant that humanity's homeworld would never again exist in baseline reality. The planet and every human being on it had become something entirely other, not dead, but no longer alive in any way that organic consciousness could understand or recognize. "We achieved victory," Commander Park whispered, watching as the Devourer fleet collapsed into confusion and began their retreat to intergalactic space. "We actually achieved the impossible." Admiral Vasquez nodded, feeling the cosmic weight of their success and its ultimate price. "Signal the Council emergency fleets. Inform them that it's safe to approach the engagement zone." Hours later, as alien vessels cautiously entered the battle area, they discovered something that would forever transform their understanding of sacrifice, determination, and the true meaning of cosmic responsibility. The human fleet had vanished, not destroyed by enemy action, but translated into the same conceptual realm as Earth, becoming eternal guardians of the idea that had saved organized matter itself. In their place floated a single message beacon, broadcasting simultaneously in every known language and several that had never existed before. To the sentient species of the galaxy, the immediate existential threat has been permanently neutralized, but the universe remains fragile and others may come. You are now the guardians of organized matter, conscious thought, and the continuation of complexity over entropy. Use this responsibility wisely. Remember that once, when existence itself faced annihilation, one species chose to become something entirely other rather than permit darkness to achieve universal victory. This represents humanity's final gift to consciousness: the knowledge that existence always remains a choice, and that choice always proves worth any sacrifice necessary to defend it. High Commander Vextar, reading the message aboard his flagship while surrounded by space that still bore scars from reality-altering combat, experienced something his species had never evolved to feel: profound respect for beings he had once dismissed as primitive barbarians. Around him, his crew worked in respectful silence, each processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed and survived. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "we're receiving communications from across the galaxy. Systems that were consumed by the Devourers are beginning to return to existence. Stars reigniting, planets reforming from quantum possibility. It appears that reality itself is healing from the damage." Vextar nodded, finally understanding what Admiral Kane had meant during that first, humiliating encounter at the Council Station. Humanity didn't build weapons to win wars. They transformed themselves into weapons to end the possibility of losing wars permanently. In the years that followed, the Galactic Council established the Terra Memorial, not for a planet that had died, but for a species that had chosen to evolve beyond individual existence for the sake of universal preservation. And in the deepest archives, sealed away from all but the most trusted keepers of cosmic knowledge, lay complete records of humanity's transformation and the weapons they had built to save consciousness itself. Because someday, when new threats emerged from the darkness between galaxies, the surviving species might need to remember what one civilization had taught them about the true nature of choice, sacrifice, and the moral weight of existence. The humans were gone, but they had left behind something infinitely more valuable than any technology or scientific discovery. They had established the principle that some ideals justified any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of one's fundamental nature. The galaxy would remember this lesson. It had no choice. Earth had made absolutely certain of that.